October 21st, 1981. Marseille. A man on a motorcycle is riding home. He is 42 years old, and he has spent the last 14 months doing something almost nobody in this city has managed to do in half a century. He has actually hurt the network. Not slowed it down. Not inconvenienced it. Hurt it. Labs shut down. Traffickers in prison. A seizure so large it made headlines 2 continents away. He has a wife. He has 2 daughters. He is, by profession, a magistrate, a judge with the power to order raids, and he has used that power like a hammer. A car pulls alongside him. The windows come down. 3 shots. He goes down in the street, and by the time anyone reaches him, Pierre Michel is dead. Here's what should stop you cold about that sentence. 19 years earlier, in 1962, a French customs agent and 2 NYPD detectives busted a heroin shipment hidden inside a Buick sedan, and Hollywood turned it into a Best Picture-winning film that told America the story was over. The French Connection ends with a freeze frame and a caption telling you a couple of guys got light sentences and the mastermind walked free. Roll credits. Case closed, more or less, in the public imagination for the next 50 years. Except the case wasn't closed. It wasn't close to closed. The organization, the movie, caught 1 shipment from didn't blink. It kept moving product through Marseille for another 2 decades through a war of assassinations, prison sentences, and a body count that makes the movie's plot look like a warm-up act. And it took a magistrate's murder in broad daylight in 1981 to finally actually end it. Tonight, we're telling you what happened before the movie, during the movie, and most importantly, the 19 years after the movie that Hollywood never touched. This is the real French Connection, and the real story isn't about 2 cops and a Buick. It's about 3 generations of one Corsican network that controlled the majority of America's heroin supply for the better part of 3 decades, and the magistrate who died trying to burn it to the ground. Before we get into it, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments. What time is it where you are right now? If you're new here, this is Long Gangster Nights, and we do deep, sourced, no-nonsense organized crime history, the kind that doesn't stop where the movie stops. Hit subscribe, get comfortable, and let's go back to where this actually starts. Not 1962, not New York. It starts in the 1920s in a port city on the Mediterranean with 2 men who didn't get a movie made about them at all. Marseille has always been a city that faces away from France. Geographically, it's French. Administratively, it's French. But functionally, for most of the 20th century, it operated like an independent economic zone that happened to fly the tricolor. It is the oldest city in the country and one of its busiest ports, a place where North Africa, the Levant, and continental Europe all funnel through the same set of docks, and where the line between legitimate shipping magnate and smuggler has historically been more of a suggestion than a rule. Into that environment, in the years after the First World War, stepped 2 men whose partnership would essentially write the operating manual for everything that came after them: Paul Carbone and François Spirito. Carbone was Corsican by heritage, a detail that matters enormously for this entire story, and we'll come back to why in a moment. He'd made his early money the way a lot of ambitious young men in the Marseille underworld did. Prostitution, protection rackets, and a firm willingness to use violence as a business tool rather than a last resort. Spirito, his partner, brought something Carbone didn't have on his own: political connections, particularly to a virulently right-wing anti-communist current running through Marseille politics in the interwar years. Together, they built what historians of the French underworld have generally called the first true organized syndicate in the city, sometimes referred to loosely as the Guérini gang's predecessors or simply the Carbone Spirito network. Though it's worth being honest that the historical record on their internal structure is considerably thinner than the record we'll have on the organizations that followed them. Much of what's documented about Carbone and Spirito comes from journalistic accounts and post-war trial testimony rather than the kind of court document paper trail we'll be working with later in the story, so treat the granular details of their operation with appropriate caution. The broad strokes are well established, the specifics less so. What is well documented is this. By the 1930s, Carbone and Spirito had made themselves useful to the political right in Marseille, most notoriously by allegedly providing muscle used against striking dockworkers and left-wing organizers, the exact same playbook, worth noting, that would resurface with the Guérinis and American intelligence more than a decade later. This wasn't incidental. It was the founding logic of Corsican organized crime's relationship with the French state for the next 50 years. We control labor unrest at the docks. In exchange, the authorities look the other way on what we're moving through those same docks. And what they were moving increasingly was opium and its derivatives. Here's where the geography of the drug trade in this era becomes essential to understand, because it explains why Marseille, of all the port cities in Europe, became the epicenter of an international heroin pipeline that would eventually supply the majority of the United States market. Turkey grew opium poppies legally for licensed pharmaceutical purposes under a quota system that was, at least on paper, regulated by international agreement. In practice, Turkish opium production regularly and substantially exceeded what the legitimate pharmaceutical market could absorb. And that surplus didn't vanish. It got diverted, sold off-book, and moved westward through a well-established smuggling corridor that ran through Syria and Lebanon, across the Mediterranean, and into Marseille. Marseille had two things no other stop on that route could offer: a genuinely enormous, chaotic, hard-to-police port complex, and, increasingly by the mid-1930s, a class of chemists capable of converting raw and semi-refined morphine base into pharmaceutical-grade heroin. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it separates Marseille from a simple transit point. Plenty of ports moved raw opium. What made Marseille irreplaceable to the pipeline was that the actual refining, the transformation from crude morphine base into the pure white heroin that would eventually reach American arms, increasingly happened inside the city itself, in clandestine laboratories tucked into ordinary-looking buildings, run by chemists whose names rarely made headlines, but whose skill was the actual engine of the entire operation. Historians and investigators who later reconstructed this period, including researchers who documented the labs discovered near Marseille beginning around 1937, established that this refining infrastructure was already substantial well before the Second World War, meaning the French connection as a manufacturing operation predates the era most people associate with the name by a full generation. Carbone and Spirito didn't invent this trade, but they positioned themselves at its center in Marseille, and in doing so, they built the template, political protection purchased through service to the state, or at least to whichever political faction currently controlled it, violent control of the docks and the labor that moved through them, and a growing web of relationships with the chemists and shippers who made the actual product. It was, in miniature, everything the Guérini brothers would later scale up to a genuinely national and then international level. Carbone's death effectively ended this first chapter. He was killed in 1943. Accounts differ on the precise circumstances, with the most commonly cited version involving a train bombing during the German occupation, though as with much of this early period, the sourcing here comes primarily from journalistic and post-war reconstructions rather than court records, so we'll flag it as the generally accepted account rather than an airtight one. What matters for our story isn't the mechanism of his death, so much as what it created: a vacuum at the top of Marseille's underworld at the exact historical moment, the years immediately following the Second World War, when the geopolitical conditions for a truly massive, internationally significant heroin trade were about to fall into place. Into that vacuum stepped two brothers who would turn a regional smuggling operation into what American and French investigators would eventually recognize as the single largest heroin supply chain in the world. Antoine and Barthélemy Guérini, the latter universally known by his nickname, Meme, were Corsican like Carbone before them, and that Corsican identity is not a footnote in the story. It's structural. Corsica, the Mediterranean island south of the French mainland, has its own language, its own deeply rooted clan and honor traditions, and a long historical relationship with organized crime that predates the Marseille networks by centuries. Corsican bandits and clan structures were already legendary within France well before the 20th century. What happened in the post-war decades wasn't Corsican criminals randomly ending up in Marseille. It was an extension of existing Corsican social networks, family ties, village ties, a mutual language and code of loyalty that outsiders, including French law enforcement, struggled to penetrate into the city's underworld and its legitimate business establishment alike. Corsicans held real positions of influence in Marseille's police, its port administration, and eventually its national politics, which meant the criminal network wasn't operating against the institutions of the city so much as running partially through them. The event that made the Guérini brothers matters most in this history, and it's a genuinely pivotal moment, one that connects post-war French labor politics directly to Cold War American intelligence policy in a way that still surprises people when they hear it laid out plainly, was the 1947 Marseille dock strike. France in late 1947 was in genuine political crisis. The communist-aligned CGD Trade Union Federation had immense power on the docks and in French heavy industry generally, and a massive wave of strikes that November threatened to paralyze the country's ports and transportation infrastructure at precisely the moment the fragile post-war French government and its American backers, deeply invested in keeping France out of the Soviet orbit as the Cold War hardened, needed those ports functioning. Marseille's docks, as one of the country's most important points of entry, were ground zero for this confrontation. This is the point in the story where the historical record gets both more solid and more explosive, so let's be precise about what's documented versus what's alleged. It is well established through Central Intelligence Agency records that have since been declassified, and through the work of historians who've researched Cold War-era covert operations in France, that the CIA, through channels including labor-attaché relationships and covert funding, worked to counter communist trade union power in France in this period, including in Marseille specifically. The broad strategic goal, breaking communist control of French ports and unions, is not in serious historical dispute. What's more specifically alleged, and here's where we need to hedge carefully because the paper trail thins considerably, is that this American-backed effort to break the 1947 strike involved direct or indirect coordination with the Guérini organization's muscle, using the brothers' existing control over dock labor and their capacity for violence and intimidation to physically break the picket lines and restore operations under conservative, non-communist union leadership. This is the version of events that has become the standard historical account, repeated across multiple journalistic and historical treatments of the period, and it fits the broader, documented pattern of American Cold War intelligence policy using organized crime assets against communist labor movements. The far better documented parallel case being Lucky Luciano's own alleged wartime cooperation with U.S. naval intelligence around the New York docks. But it's important to say plainly, the specific court-documented, ironclad proof of a direct CIA to Guérini operational arrangement in 1947 is thinner than popular retellings sometimes suggest. What we can say with confidence is that the strike was broken, that the Guérini's influence over Marseille dramatically increased in its aftermath, and that French and American authorities showed a consistent multi-decade pattern of tolerance toward Guérini trafficking activity that is very difficult to explain except as some form of ongoing political debt or protection arrangement. Whether that arrangement traces to an explicit 1947 handshake or emerged more gradually and informally afterward is a question the historical record doesn't fully settle, so we'll say it the way the more careful historians say it. Reportedly, and according to the broader pattern of documented Cold War labor operations, rather than as an established court-proven fact. What we can say without hedging is what happened next, because this part is a matter of French judicial record. In the years following the strike, French police investigations that began building cases against Guérini trafficking activity had an uncanny tendency to stall out. Witnesses recanting testimony, charges quietly dropped, prosecutions that should have proceeded simply not proceeding. This pattern repeats itself across multiple documented cases through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, and it is the single clearest piece of evidence that the Guérini brothers were operating under some form of durable institutional protection, whatever its precise origin. French intelligence services, particularly the STIS, the Foreign Intelligence Service that was the predecessor to today's DGSE, have reportedly maintained an ongoing tolerance for Guérini activity throughout this period per court-documented allegations that surface later. This too will flag with the appropriate hedge because reportedly tolerated based on pattern of behavior is a different evidentiary standard than a signed authorization, and no such document has ever surfaced publicly. The practical result of all this the broken strike, the political capital it generated, and the 2 decades of law enforcement impunity that followed, is that Antoine and Barthélemy Guérini became, for all functional purposes, the law in Marseille. Not metaphorically, Antoine, the elder brother, functioned as the strategic and political head of the organization, cultivating relationships across the French establishment, including reported ties reaching into the Gaullist political movement itself. Mime ran the more operational street-level side of the business, the enforcement, the day-to-day management of the organization's various rackets. Between the two of them, for roughly 2 decades, they controlled Marseille's docks, its labor unions, significant portions of its nightlife and gambling economy, and, most importantly for our purposes, its position as the single most important node in the entire transatlantic heroin trade. And here's the detail that should reframe everything you think you know from a movie. The French Connection, as a title, is almost a misnomer. It implies a single pipeline, a single deal, a single network that a couple of determined cops could disrupt with one good bust. What actually existed under the Guérinis was a dynasty, an ongoing, structurally embedded criminal enterprise that had survived the death of its founder, absorbed the lessons of a 1947 strike, and built itself into something closer to a shadow institution of the French state than a conventional criminal gang. The movie catches one shipment from one cell at one moment in this multi-decade story. What we're about to walk through, the actual scale of what the Guérini network built, is why that one bust barely mattered. To understand exactly how much didn't get disrupted by a single seizure in 1962, you need to understand the machine the Guérinis had built by that point, because by any reasonable estimate, it was staggering. The supply chain started as it had in Carbone and Spirito's era, with Turkish opium grown legally under license, diverted illegally in quantities that dwarfed what any pharmaceutical market could plausibly need. From Turkey, the raw and semi-processed opium moved by a combination of overland and maritime routes through Syria and Lebanon, Beirut, in particular, functioning as a critical transit and increasingly a secondary processing hub in its own right. From the Levant, shipments crossed the Mediterranean into Marseille, where the network's laboratories, descendants, both literally in some cases and structurally in all of them, of the labs first documented in the late 1930s, did the actual pharmaceutical transformation, converting morphine base into the refined, nearly pure heroin hydrochloride that commanded premium prices on the American market. The chemists who did this work are, to this day, some of the least publicly known figures in the entire story, which is itself revealing the people whose skills were most technically essential to the operation were also the people the network worked hardest to keep invisible. What is documented is that these labs achieved a level of purity and consistency that made Marseille product the gold standard of the international heroin trade for decades. American law enforcement of the era routinely cited Marseille heroin as effectively a brand name signifying quality in the same way you might reference a particular vineyard or distillery region. From the labs, the product moved to the docks, the same docks the Guérinis controlled through their labor union relationships, and onto ships bound disproportionately for New York. The specific smuggling methods evolved constantly to stay ahead of customs enforcement. Concealment in machinery, in vehicles, in shipments of legitimate goods, and as we'll get into shortly, in one very famous automobile that ended up on a New York dock in 1962. The recipients on the American end were overwhelmingly connected to the American Mafia's New York families, most prominently associates linked to the Genovese crime family's networks, who handled distribution once product reached the United States, meaning the full supply chain, start to finish, ran from Turkish poppy fields through Levantine transit points, through Corsican-controlled Marseille refineries, across the Atlantic, and into an American organized crime distribution network that push the finished product onto the street. The scale this reached by the height of the operation, in the years just before and after the 1962 bust that inspired the movie, is the number that tends to stop people cold when they hear it for the first time. By 1969, various law enforcement and historical estimates placed the Marseille network share of the heroin actually reaching American users at somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90%. We'll flag this figure the way it deserves to be flagged. It's a widely cited estimate from the period, repeated across multiple law enforcement and historical sources, rather than a single precisely audited statistic, and estimates of illegal drug market share in this era should always be understood as reasoned approximations rather than hard numbers. But even taking the low end of that range seriously, sit with what it means. For the better part of a decade, the overwhelming majority of the heroin destined for American addicts passed, at some point, through labs run by a Corsican network in a French port city, protected by a chain of political relationships stretching back to a 1947 dock strike, and before that, to a partnership between two men in the 1920s who never made it into a single Hollywood film. The movie, captures one shipment. What we've just walked through is the machine that shipment came from, a machine that in 1962 was nowhere near finished. Before we go further tonight, if you're just joining us, we've already covered ground the movie never touches. The Corsican network's roots in 1920s Marseille, the 1947 dock strike that handed the Guérini brothers 2 uncontested decades of control over the city, and the almost incomprehensible scale of what that control eventually produced, a supply chain that by the late 1960s is credibly estimated to have put somewhere between 80 and 90% of the heroin reaching American streets through a single Corsican-run pipeline. If any of that is new to you, this is a good moment to subscribe, because what's coming next is where the movie's version of the story and the real version stop rhyming with each other entirely. Let's go to New York. October 1961. Eddie Egan and Sonny Grosso were not, on paper, the kind of detectives you'd expect to end up at the center of the largest heroin seizure in American history to that date. They weren't specially credentialed. They weren't running some elite federal task force with unlimited resources and a mandate from Washington. They were 2 working narcotics detectives inside a police department that, as we've documented across this entire channel in other cases, had its own long and complicated relationship with corruption, and they did the job the way most effective narcotics detectives of that era actually did it. Not through brilliant deduction, but through informants, through hunches, and through an enormous, grinding amount of surveillance that never once looks cinematic while it's actually happening. What set this particular case apart from the hundreds of other cases Egan and Grosso worked across their careers wasn't a tip, and it wasn't an informant. It was a coincidence of the kind that shows up far more often in real police work than film writers like to admit, because we got lucky and then worked very hard for months afterward doesn't market itself the way brilliant detective cracks the case does. The 2 of them were out socially, off-duty, having a drink at a nightclub in Manhattan, when they noticed a small-time hood named Pasquale Patsy Fuca. Fuca ran a modest luncheonette on the Lower East Side, the kind of business that on paper generates a comfortable but unremarkable living. And yet here he was at a nightclub whose name would go on to become inseparable from this entire case in the popular imagination, spending money and entertaining company in a way that simply didn't track with what 2 detectives who knew the neighborhood understood his legitimate income to actually be. That's the entire origin point. 2 off-duty cops noticing that a guy's spending didn't match his day job. It's almost anticlimactic when you say it plainly, and that's exactly the point, because everything genuinely significant about this case happened in the months of unglamorous work that followed that one observation, not in the observation itself. Egan and Grosso didn't move on Fuca immediately, and they didn't move on him alone. What followed was a sustained surveillance operation, the kind of work that consists mostly of sitting in cars, tracking movements, cross-referencing who a target meets with and how often, building out a map of associates 1 meeting at a time, and doing all of it slowly enough that the target never realizes he's being watched. This is the actual substance of narcotics investigative work in this era, and it's worth pausing on that fact specifically because The French Connection as a film does depict the stretch of the case with more fidelity than it depicts almost anything else in the broader story we've been telling you. The surveillance sequences are, by most accounts of the real investigation, reasonably faithful to how tedious and how patient this kind of work actually was. Where the film starts to diverge from the historical record isn't in how the investigation was conducted. It's in what the investigation actually accomplished and what happened to the people it caught. As Egan and Grosso's surveillance widened, Tracking Fuca's movements and cross-referencing his contacts, the investigation connected him to two French nationals who had recently arrived in the country and taken up residence at a Manhattan hotel. One was Jacques Angelvin, a recognizable French television personality, a detail that matters because it tells you something about how this network operated at its edges, using people with legitimate public profiles and legitimate reasons to be traveling internationally as cover for the actual mechanics of moving product. The other was a man traveling under a passport, identifying him as Jehan. It's worth stopping here and staying on Jehan specifically for a while, because almost everything that makes the real story diverge from the film's version of events runs through this one man and the film's fictionalized version of him. The character audiences know as Frog One barely scratches what actually made him significant, both to the case in 1961 and 1962, and to the 60-year arc of Corsican trafficking we've been tracing across this entire video. Jehan was not a courier. He was not a mid-level operator brought in to handle logistics on this one shipment. By multiple historical accounts of the case, he was a genuinely senior figure within the broader Corsican trafficking network, someone with standing, with relationships, with the kind of position in the organization that made him worth protecting rather than simply worth arresting. And there is one specific detail about his biography that turns out to matter more than almost anything else in this entire episode of the story. Jehan had served during the Second World War with the French resistance. Hold on to that detail, because we're going to come back to it in a few minutes, and when we do, it's going to reframe everything about how this case actually ended. The plan that Fuca, Jehan, and their associates had put together involved smuggling a substantial quantity of heroin into the United States concealed inside a Buick sedan that Angelvin had shipped over as part of an ordinary transatlantic vehicle crossing, the kind of thing that on the surface looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like, a television personality bringing a car back from Europe. Egan and Grosso, now working in coordination with federal narcotics agents rather than running this purely as an NYPD operation, tracked the deal as it developed over the following months. They watched the network's members meet. They watched the vehicle move through the stages of its journey. And they built patiently toward the moment of actual interdiction, the point where they'd have enough to move on the shipment and the people connected to it without tipping their hand too early and losing the case entirely. Before we get to the bust itself, it's worth pausing on a detail that the film compresses into a clean, dramatic number, because the actual historical record is messier than that, and this channel has never been in the business of smoothing out messiness for the sake of a better soundbite. The exact weight of the heroin recovered in the eventual seizure is reported somewhat inconsistently across different sources from the period and from later retrospective accounts of the case. You'll find figures cited across a range spanning several dozen kilograms, with a substantial cluster of sourcing landing near the widely repeated figure of roughly 112 pounds, just over 50 kilograms, of pure heroin. We're going to state this the way the more careful historical accounts of the case stated. This was an enormous seizure by any standard of the era, almost certainly the largest heroin bust on American soil up to that point in history, full stop. But the precise weight varies somewhat depending on which specific report or retrospective you're reading. And that's a detail that matters less for the drama of the story than it does for something we're going to come back to again and again across this entire video. Even the parts of this story that popular culture treats as settled, closed, fully known, the actual 1962 bust that inspired an Oscar-winning film, have soft edges once you go looking at the underlying sourcing with any real scrutiny. This isn't a story with clean numbers anywhere in it, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. The bust itself, when it finally happened in early 1962, played out in broad strokes close to the way the film depicts it, the surveillance converging, the heroin recovered from its concealment inside the vehicle, the arrests that followed. Fuca went to prison. Angelvin, the television personality who had allowed his public profile and his ordinary-looking vehicle shipment to be used as cover for the operation, was convicted as well and served time. And Jehan, the man the entire back half of the film is structurally built around chasing, the man whose fictionalized version gives Popeye Doyle his white whale, walked away clean. This is the hinge the entire contrarian argument of this video turns on, so we're going to sit with it properly rather than rushing past it the way a lot of retellings of the story do, because it's the single fact that separates the version of this case Hollywood told American audiences from a version that actually happened. Jehan was never extradited to the United States. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because it's a genuinely remarkable outcome when you say it plainly. French authorities, facing an American case built on months of documented surveillance and an enormous seizure that directly implicated Jehan as the senior organizing figure behind the entire shipment, simply did not hand him over. Not struggled to build an extradition case. Not attempted and failed. Declined to pursue it in any way that produced his transfer to American custody ever for the rest of his life. So why? This is where that detail about his resistance service comes back into the story, and it's worth being precise about how we're presenting this, because we want to give you the strongest available explanation while being honest about exactly how well documented it actually is. The most consistently cited explanation across historical treatments of this case is that Jehan's wartime record with the resistance afforded him a level of political protection within France that made prosecuting or extraditing him for a narcotics case politically untenable for the French establishment of the early 1960s, a country less than 2 decades removed from occupation, still deeply invested in the mythology and moral authority of its resistance heroes, and simply unwilling, at some level of institutional decision-making that has never been fully documented in any single surviving record, to hand a man with that specific biography over to American prosecutors, whatever he might have actually been doing with the following 2 decades of his post-war life. We want to be honest about the evidentiary weight of that explanation, the same way we've been honest about every other claim of political protection across this entire story. This is not a claim backed by a single smoking gun document. No memo has ever surfaced explicitly stating, "We are protecting this man because of his resistance record." What we have instead is an explanation that fits an extremely well-documented pattern running through this entire 6-decade arc. Political protection consistently outweighing straightforward law enforcement action again and again across 3 separate generations of this network's operation, from the Guérini brothers' impunity following the 1947 doc strike straight through to this exact moment in the story. Given how consistently that pattern holds across cases where we do have stronger documentation, the resistance record explanation for Jehan's protection is the strongest and most consistently repeated account historians and journalists covering this case have settled on, but we're presenting it to you as the best available explanation for a well-documented outcome, not as an ironclad, independently proven fact in its own right. What is not in dispute, regardless of exactly why it happened, is what actually followed. Jehan remained in France. He remained free, and by multiple accounts of his subsequent activity, he continued to be connected to trafficking work into the 1970s and even into the early 1980s, meaning this one man, the film's entire Frog One, was still active in this world roughly 2 decades after American audiences watched a freeze frame tell them he'd gotten away, in a framing that implicitly treated his escape as the story's final, cynical grace note, rather than as what it actually was, the beginning of another 2 decades of business as usual for a man Hollywood had already narratively retired. He is generally reported to have died of natural causes in Corsica, an old man, having never spent a single day in an American prison for the shipment that made his name, or at least his fictionalized alter ego's name, a piece of American pop culture that outlived him by decades, watched by audiences who almost certainly never once wondered whether the real man behind the character had actually faced any consequences at all. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely the whole thesis of this video compressed into a single life story. The film ends on Jehan's escape as a moment of stylish, world-weary irony, the sophisticated crime drama's way of telling its audience that justice is imperfect, that not every case gets its clean ending, and that this moral complexity is somehow part of what makes the story worth telling. In reality, there was nothing especially complex or ironic about it. A senior international trafficker used a wartime honor to buy himself 2 more decades of freedom and continued criminal activity in a country that valued the symbolism of his past enough to overlook what he was actually doing with his present. That's not moral complexity. That's simply what political protection looks like when it works exactly as designed. And Jehan's freedom isn't even the most damning postscript to the 1962 case, which is a genuinely remarkable thing to be able to say. Given everything we've just walked through, there's a second postscript, and it almost never comes up in popular retellings of the story, which is exactly why we're bringing it to you in detail tonight, rather than treating it as a footnote. In the years following the bust, a significant portion of the seized heroin, the actual physical evidence, sitting in an NYPD property room, the literal, tangible proof of what was at the time the largest heroin seizure in American history, disappeared. What multiple journalistic and historical accounts of the resulting scandal describe is a systematic theft carried out by corrupt officers who had access to the property room, in which substantial quantities of the seized heroin were swapped out for flour. The repackaging was convincing enough that the substitution went undetected for a meaningful period of time, and the actual product, heroin that had been seized, logged, and presented to the public as evidence of a historic law enforcement victory, was funneled back onto the street through corrupt intermediaries, re-entering exactly the market it had supposedly been removed from. The scale of what was stolen, according to the accounts that later reconstructed the full scope of the scandal, ran into the hundreds of pounds once you account for evidence connected to other cases stored in the same property room alongside the French Connection seizure. Sit with the actual mechanics of what that means. The most triumphant law enforcement victory in this entire saga, the seizure that inspired a Best Picture-winning film, that made Egan and Grosso's names recognizable to American audiences for the following half-century, was, within a matter of years, partially recycled back into the very heroin supply it was supposedly a triumph over by members of the same police department that made the original bust. This isn't a detail the film could have included even if the filmmakers had wanted to, because the scandal broke publicly after the movie's 1971 release. The timeline simply didn't allow for it. But it belongs in any honest telling of the story, because it functions as the second half of the exact same coin as Jehan's escape. In the popular imagination, the 1962 case is a clean, closed, unambiguous victory. The good guys won, the drugs got seized, the case got closed, and Hollywood turned it into an Oscar-winning film 3 years later. In reality, its 2 most significant postscripts are a senior trafficker who walked free and kept working the same trade for another 2 decades, and a stash of recovered heroin that quietly went right back into circulation through the hands of the very department that seized it. The movie's ending isn't the network's ending. It arguably isn't even a real ending for anyone directly connected to that one specific shipment, not for the man who ran it, and not, in the most literal sense possible, for the drugs themselves. So, if the case that inspired the film barely dented the actual organization behind it, if the senior figure walked free, and even the physical evidence didn't stay off the street, what actually happened to the organization in the years that followed? This is where the story has to leave New York behind entirely and go back to Marseille, because the next chapter isn't about a single dramatic bust anymore. It's about a criminal dynasty beginning for the first time in this entire story to eat itself from the inside and getting rebuilt twice over the following 2 decades under leadership that looked less and less like the relatively controlled, politically connected model the Guérini brothers had spent 2 decades perfecting. By the mid-1960s, Antoine and Barthélemy Guérini had run Marseille in every functional sense of that word for roughly 2 decades. Since the 1947 dock strike broke communist control of the city's port infrastructure, and in the process, broke open an era of near-total impunity for the brothers' organization. They had operated as something closer to a shadow institution of the French state in Marseille than a conventional criminal gang answerable to conventional law enforcement. But empires built on personal loyalty, on violence, and on the specific political capital of a specific historical moment rarely age gracefully, and the Guérini organization, as it turned out, was no exception to that rule, however durable it had proven across the 1950s. Tension had been building for years beneath the surface of that apparent stability. Rival factions within Marseille's underworld, chafing under 2 decades of Guérini dominance, positioning themselves for an opportunity that the brothers' continued strength had, for a long time, denied them. And on June 23, 1967, that opportunity arrived in the most violent way the story has shown us yet. Antoine Guérini was shot and killed outside a garage in Marseille. We want to handle what happened next and who was actually responsible with the same care we've applied to every other disputed claim across this video, because this is a point where the temptation to pick a version and present it as settled runs directly against what the actual historical record supports. The honest answer is that Antoine Guérini's killing remains genuinely disputed. There are 2 theories that recur most consistently across journalistic and historical treatments of the assassination, and they point in meaningfully different directions. The first attributes the killing to a rival Corsican faction connected to Marcel Francisci, another major figure in Corsican organized crime in this period, with his own extensive trafficking operations and his own political connections running through different channels than the Guérinis. Under this theory, Antoine's death reflects a straightforward power struggle between competing Corsican networks for control of Marseille's rackets. A rivalry that had presumably been simmering for years and finally erupted into open violence. The second theory, which gained particular traction in later retellings of the story, points instead toward Tany Zampa, at the time still a rising figure in the Marseille underworld, not yet the dominant force he would become within just a few years, but someone who, in retrospect, clearly had both the motive and the eventual capacity to benefit enormously from the old guard's removal. Under this version, Antoine's death isn't a lateral rivalry between roughly equal factions, but the opening move of a younger, more ambitious operator clearing his own path to power. Multiple journalistic and historical accounts of this assassination present both of these as competing theories rather than as a settled question, and it's worth being direct about why that matters. No definitive court conviction ever resolved which faction, or which specific individual, was actually responsible for ordering Antoine Guérini's death. That's not a small gap in the record. That's the central unresolved mystery at the heart of the entire transition this section of the story is about, and manufacturing false certainty about it. Picking whichever theory makes for a cleaner narrative and presenting it as fact would be exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to avoid doing. So we're going to leave it exactly where the evidence actually leaves it, genuinely disputed with 2 credible candidate explanations and no definitive resolution. What is not disputed, regardless of who actually pulled the trigger or gave the order, is the effect Antoine's death had on the balance of power in Marseille. His killing broke the back of the Guérini organization's 2-decade dominance over the city in a way that nothing else, not law enforcement pressure, not political shifts in Paris, not any external force across the previous 20 years, had managed to do. Mime, who had spent those 2 decades running the more operational street-level side of the organization alongside his brother, was subsequently convicted and imprisoned on charges connected to the broader unraveling of the organization's protection and legal exposure in the years following Antoine's murder. It's worth being honest that the specific legal proceedings against Mime in this period are considerably less centrally documented in popular accounts of the story than the assassination itself is. The drama of a public killing tends to dominate the historical record in a way that the comparatively unglamorous process of a subsequent prosecution simply doesn't. But the outcome itself is clear and not in dispute. By the early 1970s, the Guérini brothers, the 2 men who had effectively functioned as the law in Marseille since the strike-breaking of 1947, whose organization had survived and thrived through every previous challenge the story has traced, were gone from power entirely. One dead in the street outside a garage, one in prison. Into the vacuum they left behind came Tany Zampa, and understanding exactly how different his rise was from the Guérini model matters enormously for how the rest of the story is going to play out, because it represents a genuine break in the underlying character of Marseille's organized crime, not just a change in personnel at the top, but a change in the entire operating logic of the city's underworld, where Antoine Guérini had spent 2 decades cultivating the appearance, at minimum, of a statesman-like figure, Someone with political connections reaching toward the Gaullist establishment, someone whose organization preferred quiet institutional protection and stalled prosecutions to open public violence, Zampa built and ran his organization according to a very different playbook. His consolidation of power across Marseille's underworld through the 1970s came through a level of overt, territorially aggressive, publicly visible gang warfare that the Guérini era, for all its underlying brutality and all the violence it was certainly capable of and did in fact use, had generally managed to keep out of the headlines. The Guérini model depended on invisibility, on the appearance of order, of legitimate business, of a Marseille that functioned smoothly precisely because its actual underworld leadership had made itself indistinguishable from the political and institutional establishment around it. Zampa's model depended on something closer to raw, visible dominance. Winning open conflicts against rival factions and making that victory known, rather than quietly absorbing rivals through political maneuvering the way the Guérinis had generally preferred to operate. And Zampa's rise through the 1970s coincided with something else, something that is not, on close examination, a coincidence at all, but a direct cause and effect relationship that's going to define the entire next chapter of the story. For the first time since the Second World War, French and American authorities were beginning to apply sustained, serious, structurally meaningful pressure to the entire Marseille heroin infrastructure. Not the sporadic, easily absorbed interdictions that had characterized law enforcement's relationship with this network for the previous 2 decades, but something genuinely different in scale and intention. Zampa built his power, in other words, at exactly the moment the machine underneath him, the machine Carbone and Spirito, had first assembled in the 1920s, that the Guérini brothers had scaled to a staggering international level across 2 decades of near total impunity, was starting for the first time in this entire story to actually break down under outside pressure, rather than simply absorbing it and continuing on unbothered. That breakdown and the man most directly responsible for causing it is where the story goes next. And it's a story that involves, of all things, a former science teacher working with almost none of the swagger or street mythology the film gave its 2 fictionalized NYPD detectives, who is going to become, in every way that actually matters except box office recognition, the real protagonist this entire saga never got in 1971. To understand why a single French magistrate would eventually matter more to this story than 2 NYPD detectives and a Best Picture Oscar, you have to first understand how thoroughly exhausted the old arrangement had become by the start of the 1970s, and how much of that exhaustion was coming from outside France entirely. For nearly a quarter century, the operating logic of Marseille's relationship with its own underworld had been consistent, almost eerily so, across 3 distinct eras of leadership: Carbone and Spirito's service to right-wing political interests in the interwar years, the Guérini brothers' role in breaking the 1947 dock strike, and the decades of prosecutorial paralysis that followed it, and now, as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, a Marseille underworld in transition with Tany Zampa, consolidating power in the vacuum left by Antoine Guérini's unsolved 1967 assassination. 3 different men, 3 different eras, one continuous thread. The state's capacity to actually prosecute the people running the pipeline had again and again proven secondary to whatever political debt or diplomatic convenience the network's protection currently represented. What changed at the start of the 1970s wasn't French will, it was American patience. By the middle of the 1960s, the scale of what Marseille was sending across the Atlantic had become something American officials could no longer treat as a regional French problem to be managed quietly through back channels. The estimates law enforcement analysts were circulating internally, the same figures we cited earlier in this video, that 80 to 90% range for Marseille's share of heroin actually reaching American users by the late 60s, were the kind of numbers that, once they started leaking into congressional testimony and press coverage, made continued diplomatic softness on the issue politically expensive for Washington. Richard Nixon, who took office in January 1969, had already begun building what would become known as the war on drugs as both a genuine policy priority and a highly visible political initiative, and heroin specifically as opposed to marijuana or the broader countercultural drug panic of the era, occupied a particular place in that framing because heroin addiction was visibly, undeniably devastating American cities in a way that generated real public alarm rather than just moral panic. A president building a signature policy initiative around heroin could not, credibly, ignore the fact that the overwhelming majority of that heroin traced back to labs in a single French port city. So, the pressure that started arriving in Paris through 1969 and into 1970 wasn't subtle. It came through diplomatic channels, through direct conversations between American and French officials, through the kind of quiet ultimatum-adjacent language that doesn't often make it into public records, but that historians of the period have reconstructed well enough to establish the basic shape of it. France needed to be seen doing something, not a raid here or there, not another quietly dropped prosecution dressed up as a victory in a press release. Something structural. What emerged in 1970 was new French narcotics legislation, a genuine tightening of penalties, and an expansion of law enforcement and judicial authority over trafficking offenses, representing, at least on paper, the most significant legal escalation against the drug trade France had enacted in the post-war period. It's worth being precise about what this law did and didn't do, because laws on paper and enforcement in practice are, as this entire story has demonstrated over and over, two very different things. The 1970 legislation gave French magistrates, investigating judges, specifically operating within the French system's distinctive juge d'instruction role, which grants an individual judicial officer direct authority to order raids, direct police investigative resources, and push a case forward largely on their own initiative rather than waiting on a prosecutor's office that might have its own reasons for moving slowly, meaningfully expanded tools. What the law could not do by itself was guarantee that any individual magistrate would actually use those tools aggressively against a network with 60 years of practice at neutralizing exactly this kind of institutional threat. That required a person. And in 1970, almost nobody in Marseille's judiciary or in the broader French establishment had any particular reason to expect that person would turn out to be a former science teacher. Pierre Michel's biography, before he became the figure this entire second half of the French Connection story actually revolves around, reads almost deliberately unglamorous, which is worth dwelling on, because it matters for understanding both how he approached the job and why the network so badly underestimated him. He had trained and worked as a science teacher before entering the judiciary, a career path that gave him none of the swaggering, street-hardened credibility that a career narcotics detective, someone like Eddie Egan, cultivating contacts in bars and nightclubs, working informants through years of accumulated street relationships, would have brought to this kind of work. What it gave him instead was something the network had much less experience defending against: a methodical, evidence-first, almost clinical approach to building cases, the instincts of someone trained to test a hypothesis rigorously rather than to operate on hunches and relationships, where the Guérini-era protection racket had spent decades learning how to neutralize the kind of investigator who could be threatened, bribed, politically maneuvered around, or simply worn down through the slow attrition of stalled prosecutions and recanted witnesses. Michel represented a different profile of threat entirely, a magistrate who approached the work like a scientist, builds a case for a hypothesis methodically, evidence by evidence, lab by lab, until the case simply became too solid to make disappear through the old channels. He entered the judiciary and, over time, was appointed as an investigating magistrate with jurisdiction that put him directly in the path of Marseille's narcotics infrastructure. A posting that, given everything we've established about how thoroughly compromised the city's law enforcement and judicial apparatus had historically been, should by all rights have produced another magistrate who quietly learned the rules of the game, who understood which prosecutions to push and which ones, mysteriously needed more evidence before they could proceed, who accepted a career of modest, safe, symbolic wins rather than genuine disruption. Marseille had produced generations of officials who learned that lesson, some of them corrupted outright, many more of them simply worn down into a kind of practical fatalism about what could actually be accomplished against the network. Michel did not learn that lesson, And the campaign he built instead, over roughly 14 months, stands as close to a genuine anomaly in this entire 6-decade history, the one sustained period in which an individual French official actually inflicted structural damage on the Marseille heroin infrastructure, rather than symbolic damage dressed up for a press conference. To understand what made his campaign different, you need to understand what he was actually targeting and why the target itself represented a departure from how French law enforcement had traditionally approached this problem. For decades, the pattern of enforcement against Marseille's trafficking networks, to the very limited extent enforcement happened at all, had tended to focus on interdiction. Catching shipments in transit, seizing product at the docks or on the roads, arresting couriers and mid-level operators who could be replaced within weeks. This is, not coincidentally, exactly the kind of enforcement the 1962 Buick bust represents on the American end of the pipeline. An enormously significant single seizure that nonetheless left the organizing infrastructure behind it almost entirely intact, as we've already established in detail. Interdiction is visible, it's dramatic, it produces good headlines and satisfying photographs of seized product laid out on tables for the press. It is also structurally close to the least damaging thing you can do to a trafficking network with the kind of production capacity Marseille had built, because seized shipments are a cost of doing business, not an existential threat, so long as the labs producing the next shipment remain untouched. Michel understood this. Whether through the analytical instincts of his scientific training or simply through the clear-eyed logic of someone new enough to the game not to have absorbed Marseille's institutional fatalism about what was actually achievable. His campaign, rather than chasing individual shipments, targeted the actual manufacturing infrastructure. Directly, the clandestine laboratories themselves, the physical sites where the transformation from raw and semi-processed morphine base into pharmaceutical-grade heroin actually happened. These were the same category of operation whose origins we traced back to the labs first documented near Marseille, beginning in 1937, descendants, in most cases quite literally, of that original refining infrastructure relocated and rebuilt over the decades, but fundamentally unchanged in their basic function and their basic vulnerability. They required skilled chemists, specific equipment, a supply of precursor chemicals, and physical premises secure enough to operate for sustained periods. Without discovery, every one of those requirements was also, from an investigator's perspective, a point of exposure if you were willing to do the patient, unglamorous work of finding it. Over the course of his roughly 14-month campaign, Michel's investigations led to the identification and dismantling of a genuinely significant number of these laboratory operations. Not a single symbolic bust, but a sustained, rolling campaign that hit the network's productive capacity repeatedly in a way that made replacement and adaptation increasingly difficult, even for an organization with 60 years of institutional experience at absorbing law enforcement pressure. The cumulative arrest and prosecution figures connected to his campaign are, as we flagged earlier, most consistently cited in the neighborhood of 70 traffickers sent to prison, a number that should be read, honestly, as the widely repeated estimate that has circulated across historical treatments of his career, rather than a precisely documented source-verified court tally we can point to with full confidence. But even granting appropriate skepticism to the precision of that specific figure, the scale of disruption it represents, relative to the near-total absence of comparable prosecutorial success across the previous 2 decades of Guérini-era operation, is not seriously in dispute. Whatever the exact number, it dwarfed anything Marseille's judiciary had managed to produce against this network in a generation. It's worth pausing here to reconstruct, as best the available record allows, what this actually looked like in practice, because the phrase dismantled a laboratory tends to flatten an enormously labor-intensive, genuinely dangerous process into a single tidy sentence, and that flattening does a disservice to what Michel and the investigators working with him were actually doing month after month. Building a case against a clandestine heroin laboratory in early 1970s Marseille required first identifying that the lab existed at all, no small task, given that these operations were, by design, housed in unremarkable buildings, often in working residential or light industrial districts, specifically chosen to avoid drawing attention. That identification work depended on a combination of informant development, financial and property record analysis, and the kind of patient physical surveillance that doesn't photograph, well, but constitutes the overwhelming majority of actual narcotics investigative labor in any era. Once a location was identified, building a prosecutable case meant establishing to a standard that could survive the kind of aggressive legal defense a well-resourced trafficking organization could mount, that the specific individuals connected to that location were knowingly engaged in the manufacture of a controlled substance, not simply that heroin had been found on a premises, but that a chain of evidence connected specific people to specific criminal conduct in a way that would hold up. Against exactly the kind of witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and political interference that had derailed Marseille prosecutions for decades before Michel's campaign began. This is, again, where his background as someone trained to build a case methodically rather than to operate on relationships and street instinct appears to have mattered enormously. Multiple accounts of his working method emphasize a magistrate who was personally directly involved in directing raids and investigative work, rather than simply reviewing evidence assembled by others at a remove, a level of hands-on engagement that was, within the culture of the French judiciary at the time, itself somewhat unusual for someone in his position, and that put him personally, physically, in proximity to exactly the kind of danger that would eventually catch up with him. The single most operationally significant success of the campaign, and the one that receives the most consistent attention across accounts of his career, involved the interdiction connected to a vessel generally identified in historical treatments of the period as the Caprice de Temps. The specifics of this seizure, the exact quantity involved, the precise mechanics of how the vessel and its cargo were identified and intercepted, are documented with less granular consistency across different sources than we'd ideally want for a fully airtight account, and we're going to be honest about that rather than manufacturing false precision. What is consistently reported is that this seizure represented a major interdiction connected directly to Michel's broader campaign against the trafficking infrastructure, and that it was cited alongside the cumulative effect of the lab dismantling work as a central piece of evidence for the genuinely remarkable public claim that emerged from American officials by the mid-1970s, that Marseille's role as a primary source of heroin reaching the United States had been, in Nixon era, characterizations of the situation effectively broken. That characterization deserves the same careful hedging we've applied throughout this video to every claim of victory in this story, because declared gone and actually gone have never once been the same thing across 60 years of this network's history. What can be said with confidence is that within the specific window of Michel's active campaign, the volume and reliability of Marseille-sourced heroin reaching the American market did decline in a way that showed up in law enforcement and public health data of the period. A genuine, measurable disruption, not merely a rhetorical one. What cannot be said with the same confidence is that this disruption represented anything close to a permanent dismantling of the trafficking infrastructure itself, as opposed to a temporary, if serious, setback that a determined and well-resourced network. One that had, after all, survived Carbone's death, absorbed the loss of the Guérini brothers, and rebuilt itself under Zampa within a matter of years, retained every capacity to eventually recover from. The broader arc of international heroin trafficking in the decades that followed this story would go on to demonstrate very clearly that source regions and trafficking routes adapt and relocate far more readily than any single enforcement campaign, however successful, can permanently suppress. Michel did not end the international heroin trade. He inflicted the single most significant sustained wound the Marseille-specific machine had absorbed in the better part of half a century, and he did it as one man working within a judicial system that had spent decades demonstrating repeatedly that it was structurally inclined not to let this kind of thing happen, that inclination is worth returning to directly, because it's the context that makes Michel's campaign genuinely remarkable rather than simply a natural consequence of the 1970 legislation, doing what it was designed to do. New laws don't enforce themselves. Every institutional pattern we've traced across this video, from the collapse of prosecutions against the Guérini brothers in the years following the 1947 dock strike, to the Stisa's reported multi-decade tolerance of Guérini activity, to the political protection that kept Jehan out of an American courtroom despite direct evidence connecting him to the largest heroin bust in the country's history, represented a French state apparatus that had again and again found reasons not to fully use the authority it nominally possessed against this specific network. The 1970 law gave magistrates expanded tools. It did not, by itself, change the underlying political and institutional culture that had spent 6 decades finding reasons to look away. Michel's campaign is significant precisely because it represents an individual actor within that system choosing to actually use the tools available to him aggressively and personally against an organization with a well-established, well-documented track record of neutralizing exactly this kind of threat through means that range from bureaucratic obstruction all the way up to violence. And the network, over the course of those 14 months, would have watched this happen with an escalating and entirely rational alarm. This was not a magistrate who could be expected to lose interest, who could be managed through the kind of quiet institutional friction that had worn down predecessor after predecessor. This was not a case that was going to mysteriously stall for lack of evidence, the way cases against the Guérini brothers had stalled for 2 decades. Every lab Michel's investigations dismantled, every trafficker his campaign sent to prison, represented not just an immediate operational loss, but a demonstration, increasingly undeniable month after month, that the old rules, the ones that had kept this business running with something close to impunity since the 1920s, no longer reliably applied. By the closing months of his campaign, Pierre Michel had made himself, through raw sustained effectiveness rather than through any particular position of institutional power beyond what any investigating magistrate technically possessed, into the single most dangerous individual threat this network had faced in living memory. Not because he held more formal authority than any of the magistrates who preceded him in Marseille's judiciary. He didn't particularly, but because he was, as far as the available record allows us to judge, one of vanishingly few officials in this entire 60-year story who simply used the authority he already had consistently personally and without the kind of hesitation that had defined so much of the institutional response to this network across the preceding decades. He had a wife. He had 2 daughters. He had, by the accounts of those who worked around him during this period, a personal dedication to the work that went beyond the professional obligations of the role, the conduct of someone who appears to have understood, at some level, exactly what kind of organization he was dismantling piece by piece, and exactly what the historical track record suggested that organization was capable of doing to people who threatened it in ways that couldn't be managed through the old channels. 14 months is not a long campaign, measured against the 60-year arc this entire video has traced, but it was long enough to dismantle labs whose ancestry stretched back to the 1930s, long enough to send something in the neighborhood of 70 traffickers into a French prison system that had, for most of the preceding 2 decades, functioned as something closer to a revolving door for this particular network. Long enough to contribute directly to a public American declaration that the machine had been broken, and long enough, as we'll pick back up in the next part of the story, to generate enemies with both the motive and, as this network had demonstrated with brutal consistency across 3 generations of leadership, the established willingness to answer a threat like Pierre Michel with exactly the kind of violence the story has shown you again and again, that this organization reaches for when the old protections finally, unmistakably, stop working. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a city at the end of an ordinary October day, and October 21st, 1981 in Marseille began, by every account that survives it, as exactly that kind of ordinary day. Pierre Michel had spent 14 months building a campaign that had, by any honest measure, already outlasted the operational lifespan of most magistrates who ever tried something similar against this network. He had labs dismantled behind him. He had roughly 70 traffickers moving through the French prison system because of work his office had done. He had, by some accounts of American diplomatic characterizations from the period, contributed to a public declaration out of Washington that the Marseille pipeline The pipeline this entire video has traced back to Corsican dockworkers and political fixers in the 1920s had effectively been broken, and he had, that evening, done something so mundane it barely registers as a detail worth mentioning in any other context. He got on his motorcycle to ride home. That mundanity is worth sitting with for a moment before we go further, because it's easy in hindsight to narrate a man's death as though we're building toward an inevitable climax the whole time, as though everyone involved, including Michel himself, understood October 21st as a day of reckoning rather than as an unremarkable Wednesday. The honest version of this story doesn't get to borrow that kind of narrative tidiness. Michel rode a motorcycle regularly. He had a routine. He had, as far as the record allows us to judge, no reason on that particular evening to expect that this ride home would be different from the hundreds of ordinary commutes that had preceded it across 14 months of increasingly dangerous work. That's not a failure of caution on his part to be second-guessed after the fact. It's simply what living under a threat that has not yet fully materialized actually looks like for a magistrate in 1981 Marseille, just as much as for anyone else. You cannot suspend your entire life in permanent anticipation of violence that hasn't come yet, and Michel, by all accounts, hadn't. A vehicle pulled alongside him as he rode. What followed took, by the nature of these things, only seconds, the kind of interval that later gets reconstructed painstakingly in a courtroom, sentence by sentence, testimony by testimony, but that in the moment itself would have been almost too fast for a human nervous system to fully process as it happened. Multiple shots were fired at him from the vehicle. He was hit, and he went down in the street. He died from his wounds. He was 42 years old. It's worth pausing here deliberately before moving into the investigation and the trial that eventually followed, because there's a real risk in a story like this, one of letting the procedural aftermath, the years of investigative work, the eventual 1988 trial, the sentences handed down, crowd out the human weight of what actually happened on that street in October 1981. This video has spent a great deal of time appropriately on structures, supply chains, political protection arrangements, institutional patterns of impunity stretching back 6 decades. Those structures matter, and we're going to return to them. But structures don't get shot off a motorcycle. A person does. Pierre Michel had a wife. He had 2 daughters. Whatever else is true about the vast, sprawling, multi-generational criminal network this video has spent its runtime tracing. The Corsican clan structures, the Cold War intelligence entanglements, the decades of prosecutorial paralysis, the staggering scale of a pipeline that at its height supplied the overwhelming majority of heroin reaching American cities, all of that abstraction resolves on the evening of October 21st, 1981, into a family in Marseille who were expecting a husband and a father to come home from work, and who instead learned that he would not be coming home at all. That is the actual center of gravity this story has been building toward since the cold open of this video, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than rushed past on the way to the trial. It's also worth being honest about something else, for as much research and documentation exists around the broader arc of the Marseille network, the Guérini brothers' political entanglements, the mechanics of the 1962 seizure, and its aftermath, the Turkish opium quota system that fed the entire pipeline for decades, the granular personal record of who Pierre Michel was as a private individual, outside the professional context of his 14-month campaign, is considerably thinner in the historical and journalistic material that has made it into English language and broadly accessible sourcing. We know his professional trajectory. The science teacher who became an investigating magistrate, the systematic lab dismantling campaign, the cumulative arrest figures, the diplomatic significance American officials attach to his work. What we don't have in the sourcing available for a project like this one is a rich, textured biographical portrait of him as a husband, as a father, as a person with interests and relationships outside the courthouse, and rather than inventing that texture to make for a more satisfying piece of narrative television, we're going to name that gap honestly. What we can say with confidence is limited to the documented facts. His age at death, his family structure, his professional record, and the circumstances of the killing itself. Anything beyond that risks manufacturing intimacy the historical record doesn't actually support, And that's not a trade this channel makes, even in service of a more emotionally satisfying scene. What happened in the aftermath investigatively is itself a story worth understanding carefully, because it says something significant about exactly how much and how little had actually changed in the relationship between the French state and Marseille's organized crime networks by the early 1980s, 60 years into the arc this video has traced. An investigation into Michel's murder began, as would be expected following the killing of a sitting magistrate. But it's worth stating plainly what the timeline of that investigation actually tells us. The trial connected to his assassination did not take place until 1988, 7 years after the killing itself. 7 years is an extraordinarily long interval between a homicide and a trial by almost any standard, and it's worth resisting the temptation to read that interval as either a simple, uncomplicated story of dogged persistence finally paying off, or as straightforward evidence of continued institutional obstruction of the kind that had derailed Guérini-era prosecutions for decades. The honest answer, given the limitations of the sourcing available for a case like this, sits somewhere in between those two clean narratives, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. What we can say is this: building a prosecutable case against individuals connected to organized assassination of a public official in a criminal milieu with the resources, the institutional experience, and the demonstrated historical willingness to intimidate witnesses and obstruct proceedings that this network had shown across every single preceding chapter of the story is genuinely difficult work. The kind of work that takes years under the best of circumstances and considerably longer. Under circumstances where at least some of the old patterns of interference this video has documented extensively may well have still been in play, even if we can't point to a specific, individually documented instance of obstruction in Michel's case, the way we can for some of the Guérini-era prosecutions decades earlier. What the trial in 1988 ultimately produced was convictions and life sentences for individuals found to have orchestrated the assassination. This is, by the standards this entire video has set for measuring accountability across this story, a genuinely significant outcome. Arguably the single most consequential legal reckoning connected to organized crime activity in Marseille across the entire six-decade arc we've traced from Carbone and Spirito's rise in the 1920s straight through to this trial. Antoine Guérini's 1967 killing, as we covered earlier in this video, never produced a definitive court-established answer to who was responsible, let alone a conviction. The competing theories involving Marcel Francisci's faction and Tany Zampa's rising organization remain, to this day, exactly that: competing theories, not a legally settled matter. Jehan, the senior trafficking figure at the center of the case that inspired the 1962 bust and the film that followed it, never faced American prosecution at all, protected, as we discussed, by a resistance record that made extradition politically untenable for a French establishment less than 2 decades removed from the occupation. Across 60 years of documented trafficking, violence, political corruption, and institutional protection, the 1988 conviction of Pierre Michel's killers stands out as something close to an anomaly. A case where the machinery of French justice, however belatedly, however many years after the fact, actually produced the outcome its own laws nominally promised. That anomaly is worth sitting with, honestly, because it cuts in an uncomfortable direction. For 6 decades, the people who ran heroin into American cities in quantities that at their peak supplied the overwhelming majority of the domestic market operated with a level of impunity this video has documented in granular, repeated detail. Protection arrangements trace back to a 1947 dock strike, prosecutorial paralysis lasting decades, a senior international trafficker who died an old man in Corsica, having never answered for a bust that made international headlines. None of that, not the addiction, not the deaths on the American end of the pipeline that this trade generated across generations, not the corruption scandals, not even the theft and resale of the actual physical evidence from the case that inspired a Best Picture-winning film, produced anything close to the kind of sustained, serious, resourced prosecutorial effort that followed the killing of one French official. It took the murder of a magistrate, one of the state's own, to finally generate a reckoning with real teeth 7 years after the fact. There's no way to tell that part of the story that doesn't carry an implicit judgment about where institutional priority actually sat across this entire 6-decade arc, and we're not going to soften that judgment for the sake of a tidier ending. It is simply what the historical record, read honestly and in full, actually shows. It's worth stepping back at this point in the story to consider what Michel's assassination actually represents in the larger architecture of the narrative this video has been building since its opening minutes, because the placement matters as much as the event itself. We opened this video on this exact moment. The motorcycle, the vehicle pulling alongside, the 3 shots, a body in a Marseille street in October 1981, deliberately withholding the full resolution of it until we had first walked you through everything that came before. Carbone and Spirito in the 1920s, the Guérini brothers and the 1947 dock strike, the staggering scale of the pipeline by the late 1960s, the Copacabana surveillance, and the Buick bust that inspired the film Jehan's, escape and the stolen evidence scandal, Antoine Guérini's unsolved 1967 killing, Zampa's rise, and finally Pierre Michel's 14-month campaign against the labs that had, by that point, been operating in one form or another for close to half a century. That structural choice was deliberate, and now that we've arrived back at the moment we opened on, it's worth naming exactly why. The French Connection, as a film, ends in 1962 on an ambiguous note that plays, in the context of an American cop movie, as a kind of world-weary cynicism. The bad guy got away. The system is imperfect. Roll credits. Audiences who watched that film in 1971, and audiences who have watched it in the decades since, have absorbed that ending as essentially the end of the story, a satisfying, if bittersweet, conclusion to a genuinely dramatic true crime narrative. What this video has tried to establish, methodically across everything preceding this section, is that 1962 wasn't an ending at all. It was roughly the midpoint of a story that had already been running for 4 decades by the time the Buick got searched on a New York dock, and that had another 2 full decades of runway ahead of it. Decades that included a criminal dynasty's internal civil war, the rise of a new and more violently aggressive leadership generation, a magistrate's unprecedented campaign against the network's productive infrastructure, and finally that magistrate's assassination in the street. If the 1962 bust is the film's climax, Michel's death is this story's actual climax, the moment where the accumulated weight of everything this video has documented, all 60 years of it, resolves into a single, devastating, undeniably real human consequence. Popeye Doyle, at the end of the film, fires his gun into an empty hallway, chasing a man he'll never catch, and the scene plays as tragic irony precisely because nothing was actually resolved, the frustration of institutional failure rendered as a single frustrated gesture. Pierre Michel's death is not irony. It is not a metaphor for institutional failure. It is what institutional failure, compounded across 60 years and finally confronted head-on by one person willing to actually use the authority available to him, costs in the most literal and irreversible sense there is. There's one more dimension of this section worth addressing directly, because an honest telling of the story requires it, even though it complicates the narrative in ways that a simpler, more triumphant version of this section would prefer to avoid. What, precisely, did Pierre Michel's death actually accomplish for the organization that ordered it, and did it achieve what they presumably wanted it to achieve? The honest answer, drawn from the broader arc of Marseille's organized crime history in the years following 1981, is genuinely mixed, and it resists the kind of clean resolution a documentary script often wants to reach for at its climax. On one hand, the 1988 trial and its life sentences represented, as we've already discussed, a genuinely unprecedented legal reckoning for this network. An outcome that, if the assassination's purpose was to demonstrate that the old rules of impunity still applied, arguably backfired in the most consequential way possible. Killing Michel did not restore the pre-1970 status quo of prosecutorial paralysis. It produced, however belatedly, the single most significant conviction connected to organized crime violence in the entire 6-decade history this video has traced. On the other hand, it's worth being clear-eyed about what the assassination did accomplish in the more immediate and narrower sense. It removed, permanently, the single individual most responsible for the most sustained structural damage this network had suffered in living memory. Whatever the eventual legal consequences for those convicted of ordering the killing, Pierre Michel himself did not get to continue the work. The 70-some prosecutions his campaign had generated were not themselves undone by his death, but the ongoing campaign the next 14 months and the 14 months after that, the labs that might have been dismantled in 1982 and 1983 had he lived to keep working, never happened. There is no way to measure that specific counterfactual loss with any precision, and we're not going to manufacture a false statistic to fill that gap. But it's worth naming as part of the honest cost of what happened on that Marseille street. Not only a family that lost a husband and a father, but an entire trajectory of institutional pressure against this network that ended abruptly at exactly the moment it had begun to demonstrate real and sustained effectiveness. That's the genuinely uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this section and of this entire video's larger argument. Institutional accountability, when it finally arrived for this network, arrived 7 years late, and arrived only after the single most effective individual threat the organization had faced in 60 years had already been permanently silenced. The 1988 convictions matter. They represent something real, but they are not, in any meaningful sense, a victory that returns what was actually lost on October 21st, 1981. As we move toward the close of the story, it's worth holding both halves of that truth simultaneously, because that's what an honest accounting of this entire 6-decade arc demands. Pierre Michel's campaign was genuinely substantively effective in a way that stands apart from almost everything else this video has documented across 60 years of institutional failure, political protection, and prosecutorial paralysis. And Pierre Michel is dead, killed in the street by a network that had spent 6 decades demonstrating exactly what it was willing to do to anyone who threatened it in ways the old channels of political protection and bureaucratic obstruction could no longer contain. The film that made this story internationally famous ends on ambiguity, a chase that doesn't resolve, a trafficker who gets away, a caption informing the audience of light sentences and continued freedom, all of it rendered with a kind of stylish, cynical detachment that plays, in the context of early 1970s American cinema, as sophisticated moral complexity. What actually happened after that film's cameras stopped rolling was not ambiguous at all. It was a magistrate 14 months into the most effective anti-trafficking campaign this network had ever faced, shot dead on a motorcycle in the city his work had spent over a year trying to protect. There is nothing stylish about that ending. There is nothing cynically satisfying about it. It is simply what it cost, in the end, for one person to actually do the thing that 60 years of institutional history had shown, again and again, that the system was not built to allow. Every documentary about organized crime eventually has to answer a question that sounds simple and almost never is. What actually happened to the name? Not the people, not the organization, not the drugs. The name itself, the label history settled on to describe what we've spent this entire video unpacking. And in this case, the answer to that question turns out to be one of the most quietly revealing details in the whole 6-decade story, because the name most people know this network by is not, in any meaningful sense, a name the network ever used for itself. The Corsican Mafia is a phrase that functions in the popular imagination almost interchangeably with the French Connection, two labels for essentially the same set of people, the same pipeline, the same decades of Marseille-centered heroin trafficking. We've spent this entire video tracing from Paul Carbone in the 1920s through Pierre Michel's assassination in 1981. And it's worth being precise about where that label actually comes from, because the answer complicates the tidy, Hollywood-shaped picture most audiences carry into a story like this one. The people inside this world, the traffickers, the enforcers, the political fixers, the chemists, the dock workers whose labor and loyalty made the whole machine function across 3 generations of leadership, did not, by the most consistent historical and journalistic accounts of Corsican organized crime in this period, refer to themselves as a mafia at all. The term they used, when they used one, was le milieu, the environment or the underworld, in a much looser, less institutionally freighted sense than the word mafia carries in English, with all the baggage that word has accumulated from a century of Sicilian American organized crime mythology, Hollywood filmmaking, and journalistic shorthand. Le milieu describes something closer to a social and professional ecosystem than a formal criminal institution, a world of relationships, obligations, and shared codes of conduct that Corsican organized crime figures move through, rather than a single hierarchical organization with a name, a formal membership structure, and an institutional identity in the way the term mafia implies to most English-speaking audiences, shaped as that expectation has been by decades of exposure to the specific structure of the Sicilian and Sicilian-American Cosa Nostra. This distinction is not merely academic pedantry, and it's worth resisting the urge to treat it as a minor footnote before moving on to a tidier closing summary. It goes directly to the heart of the contrarian argument this entire video has been building since its opening minutes, that the French Connection, as popular culture understands and consumes it, is fundamentally a story about a mislabeled, misunderstood, and dramatically compressed version of something far larger, far messier, and far more institutionally embedded than the film format, or, frankly, most conventional organized crime storytelling, is generally built to convey. Mafia, in the way American audiences have absorbed the term through decades of film and television built primarily around Italian-American organized crime, implies a specific kind of structure, formal induction rituals, a recognized hierarchy of bosses and underbosses and soldiers, a codified set of rules governing membership and conduct, an institution with continuity that persists independent of any single individual's leadership. Whether or not that popular image accurately captures the internal realities of Cosa Nostra itself is a separate question this video isn't equipped to adjudicate. What matters for our purposes is that when journalists and later filmmakers needed a term to describe the Corsican trafficking networks centered on Marseille, mafia was the available cultural shorthand, a word audiences already understood, attached to a network that, as this entire video has demonstrated in granular detail, actually operated according to a substantially different logic. Not a formal hierarchical institution with codified membership, but a set of overlapping Corsican clan and village relationships, personal loyalties built on shared language and shared regional identity, and this is the detail that matters most, a deep structural embeddedness within the legitimate institutions of the French state itself, rather than existing as a purely external criminal organization, operating in opposition to those institutions. That distinction is, in many ways, the single most important corrective this entire video has tried to offer across everything we've covered. The Guérini brothers were not simply criminals who successfully evaded law enforcement. They were, for 2 decades, functionally integrated into the political and institutional life of Marseille, connected, as we discussed at length, to Cold War intelligence operations against communist labor organizing, to Gaullist political networks, to a French intelligence apparatus that appears, by the pattern of behavior across decades, even where individual documentary proof remains thin, to have tolerated their activity as a kind of ongoing political accommodation rather than confronting it as straightforward criminal conduct to be prosecuted. Jehan's protection from extradition traced directly back to his standing within the French resistance mythology of a nation less than 2 decades removed from occupation, an institutional protection that had nothing to do with criminal cunning and everything to do with a specific, historically contingent form of political and cultural capital that a purely external mafia, in the popular sense of an organization operating entirely outside legitimate institutions, would never have had access to in the first place. Le milieu, in other words, is a more honest term than Corsican Mafia, precisely because it doesn't import a false institutional formality onto something that was, at its core, a network of personal and political relationships stretched across 6 decades. Relationships that happened to organize an extraordinarily lucrative and destructive international heroin trade, but that were never structured, run, or understood by the people inside it the way mafia, as a word, tends to make outside. Jehan s'imagine. With that naming distinction established, it's worth using this closing section to do something the individual chapters of the story by necessity couldn't fully do on their own. Step back and actually trace the complete shape of the arc, from beginning to end, in a single continuous line, so the scale of what this video has actually covered becomes visible all at once rather than remaining scattered across 9 separate sections built around individual eras and individual figures. It begins in the 1920s in a Marseille that had already established itself through pure accident of geography as one of the most important port cities in the Mediterranean. A place where North Africa, the Levant, and continental Europe all converged, and where the practical distance between legitimate shipping and organized smuggling had always been thinner than French law technically allowed for. Paul Carbone and François Spirito built. In that environment, the first version of the template this entire story would follow for the next 60 years. Political service purchased through violence, muscle deployed against striking dockworkers and left-wing labor organizers in exchange for the tolerance, and eventually the active protection of powerful political patrons combined with an emerging capacity to actually manufacture rather than simply transport a refined narcotic product. The labs discovered near Marseille, beginning in 1937, represent the first hard documentary evidence of that manufacturing capacity, and they establish something crucial for understanding everything that follows. The French connection was never primarily a story about transportation. Lots of ports move drugs through. What made Marseille specifically indispensable to this entire international pipeline for 6 decades was that the actual chemistry, the transformation of raw and semi-processed opium derivatives into pharmaceutical-grade heroin, happened inside the city itself, performed by chemists whose skill was the actual technical engine of everything that followed, and whose names, tellingly, almost never surface in the popular history of the story at all. Carbone's death in 1943 created the vacuum that Antoine and Barthélemy Guérini filled in the years immediately following the Second World War, and their rise is inseparable from one of the most genuinely surprising threads this entire video has had to navigate carefully: the intersection between post-war French labor politics and early Cold War American intelligence policy. The 1947 Marseille dock strike and the broken communist control of the city's port infrastructure that followed it sits at the center of that intersection, a moment where documented CIA strategic interest in countering communist trade union power in France converges, at least in the broad strokes repeated across the historical record, with the Guérini organization's rise to unprecedented influence over the city. We were careful in the section where we first covered this to hold the most specific version of that connection, a direct, provable operational CIA to Guérini arrangement with appropriate hedging, because the ironclad documentary proof of that specific claim is thinner than some popular retellings suggest. What is not thin, what is instead about as well established as anything in this entire 6-decade story, is the pattern that followed. 2 decades of French prosecutorial paralysis against an organization that somehow repeatedly saw witnesses recant and charges quietly dropped, in a pattern that is very difficult to explain as coincidence. That 2-decade dynasty built. In the process, the actual machine we walked through in detail, Turkish poppy fields operating under a licensed quota system that never came close to constraining actual production, opium moving through Syrian and Lebanese transit points with Beirut functioning as both a waypoint and a secondary processing hub, product arriving in Marseille to be transformed in laboratories whose lineage traced back to the 1930s, and finished heroin moving out through the same. Docks the Guérinis controlled through their labor relationships, headed disproportionately for New York and the American Mafia's distribution networks, waiting to receive it. By the late 1960s, this machine had reached a scale that remains, even accounting for the appropriate statistical hedging we applied when we first cited the figure, genuinely difficult to comprehend. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of the heroin actually reaching American users for the better part of a decade, traceable back to this single network in this single French city. Against that backdrop, the case that inspired the French Connection, the 1961 nightclub surveillance, the months of patient work by Egan and Grosso, the Copacabana-adjacent origins of the whole investigation, the eventual discovery of the shipment concealed in Angel Vin's Buick, the arrests of Fuca and Angel Vin, and, crucially, Jehan's escape back to a France that would never hand him over, represents, in the true scale of this story, a single successful interdiction against one shipment. moving through one cell of an organization that at that exact moment was operating at close to the absolute peak of its historical capacity. The film treats this as a culminating triumph, however cynically undercut by its ambiguous ending. The actual history treats it as barely a dent, a genuinely large seizure, the largest of its kind to that point, but one that left the labs, the shipping relationships, the political protection, and the vast majority of the pipeline's actual capacity completely untouched. And the stolen evidence scandal that followed within a matter of years, corrupt officers swapping seized heroin for flour in an NYPD property room, funneling the recovered product quietly back onto American streets, stands as a final, almost darkly ironic postscript that the film's 1971 release date meant it could never have included. Even the small piece of this pipeline the case actually did manage to remove from circulation didn't stay removed for long. The back half of this story, the part the movie never got to tell because it happened well after the film's release, traces the machine's slow, violent unwinding across the 1970s and into the early 1980s. Antoine Guérini's unsolved 1967 assassination, a killing this video has been careful to present as genuinely disputed between rival theories involving Marcel Francisci's faction and Tany Zampa's rising organization, rather than manufacturing a false certainty the court record itself never established, broke the two-decade dominance of the Guérini dynasty, and opened the door for Zampa's more overtly violent consolidation of Marseille's underworld through the following decade. And against that backdrop of internal criminal transition, a genuinely different kind of pressure began arriving from outside France, entirely sustained American diplomatic and political pressure, driven by a Nixon administration building its signature war on drugs initiative around exactly the kind of embarrassing statistics this video has cited throughout, forcing France into the 1970 narcotics legislation that finally gave French magistrates expanded tools against trafficking, and pressuring Turkey into its 1971 opium cultivation ban that struck directly at the pipeline's literal agricultural route. Into that newly created legal and political space stepped Pierre Michel, a former science teacher turned investigating magistrate, whose 14-month campaign against the network's laboratory infrastructure represents, across this entire six-decade arc, close to the single most effective sustained disruption the machine ever absorbed. Roughly 70 traffickers sent to prison, a significant portion of the network's productive laboratory capacity dismantled, a major interdiction connected to the vessel identified in historical accounts as the Caprice de Temps, and by the mid-1970s, a public declaration from American officials up to and including characterizations reaching the Nixon administration itself that the Marseille pipeline had effectively been broken. And then on October 21st, 1981, a vehicle pulled alongside his motorcycle and 3 shots ended both his life and, in the most literal and permanent sense possible, the specific campaign of institutional pressure he represented. A pressure this entire story has demonstrated repeatedly was one of vanishingly few genuine threats this network ever actually faced across 60 continuous years of operation. The 1988 trial and the life sentences that followed represent a genuinely unprecedented legal reckoning within the specific context of this story's history of impunity, but they arrived 7 years after the fact, and they could not, in any sense that matters, undo what was actually lost on that Marseille street. 1,937 to 1981. 64 years. If you're measuring from the earliest documented laboratory infrastructure through Pierre Michel's assassination, or closer to 60 years if you're measuring from Carbone and Spirito's rise in the 1920s. Either way you frame it, the timeline this video has actually covered dwarfs by a factor of roughly 30 the 2-year window, 1961 to 1962, that the French Connection as a film actually depicts. That ratio is, in the end, the entire contrarian thesis of this video compressed into a single comparison, and it's worth stating plainly rather than leaving it implied. One of the most celebrated organized crime films ever made, a film that won Best Picture, that gave American popular culture its enduring cultural shorthand for an entire category of international drug trafficking, that turned two real detectives' names into recognizable cultural touchstones, that film captures a genuine, dramatic, well-documented episode that represents something in the neighborhood of 3% of the actual timeline this network operated across. Everything else, the 4 decades that preceded the bust and the 2 decades that followed it, happened almost entirely outside the frame of what most audiences understand the story to be. This is not a criticism of the film as a piece of filmmaking, and it would be a mistake for this video to close by pretending otherwise. The French Connection is, by any reasonable standard, a genuinely well-constructed piece of 1970s American cinema, and the case it dramatizes, the Copacabana surveillance, the patient investigative work, the bust itself, is a legitimately significant piece of narcotics enforcement history in its own right, regardless of how much or how little it actually disrupted the broader machine behind it. The film was never under any obligation to tell the entire 60-year story of Corsican organized crime in Marseille. No single 2-hour film reasonably could. And holding a 1971 crime drama accountable for failing to anticipate a magistrate's assassination a full decade after its release would be an obviously unfair standard to apply. What this video has tried to do instead is something different, to take the specific, genuinely dramatic episode the film captures and place it back inside the actual scale of the story it was always a small piece of, to show you that the French Connection was never a single connection at all, in the singular sense the title implies. It was a dynasty, 3 generations of leadership from Carbone through the Guérini brothers, through Zampa, a political protection apparatus that traced back through Cold War intelligence entanglements and post-war labor politics to relationships that predated the drug trade itself. A manufacturing infrastructure sophisticated enough to make Marseille heroin recognized standard of quality across an entire international market for the better part of half a century. And, in the end, a body count and a human cost that the film's cynical, ambiguous freeze frame ending never had the timeline to actually depict, because the worst of it, the murder that finally forced a real reckoning, hadn't happened yet. There's a version of this closing section that would end here on the naming point and the full arc recap and call the thesis delivered. But an honest documentary about a story this long owes its audience one more thing before the credits. Some account, however brief, of what happened to the actual pipeline after Pierre Michel's death, because the war ended when the magistrate died, would be its own kind of dramatically satisfying but historically incomplete closing note. And this video has spent 9 sections now establishing that satisfying, tidy endings are almost never what this story actually delivers. What the broader historical record shows in the years and decades following 1981 is not a single dramatic collapse of Corsican organized crime in Marseille, but something closer to what has happened repeatedly at every previous inflection point in this story. Fragmentation, adaptation, and a gradual shift in the geography of the broader international heroin trade that had less to do with any single French law enforcement victory and more to do with larger structural changes in global drug trafficking routes through the final decades of the 20th century. Marseille's specific dominance as the primary refining and transit hub for heroin reaching the United States did genuinely decline in the years following Michel's campaign and the broader pressure of the 1970s. That much is not seriously in dispute, and it represents real, if partial, vindication for everything Michel's work was trying to accomplish. But the underlying demand that had made Marseille so profitable for 60 years didn't disappear, along with the pipeline that had been serving it. Over the following decades, other source regions and other trafficking routes, a broader and more geographically diffuse set of networks than the single Corsican-dominated pipeline this video has traced, emerged to meet a market that Marseille's decline had left partially, but never permanently, unserved. That's not a triumphant note to end a documentary on, and this video isn't going to manufacture one where the actual history doesn't support it. It is instead a genuinely honest one, and it circles back to something worth stating directly as this story closes. The deepest lesson buried in 6 decades of Corsican organized crime history in Marseille isn't really about Corsica or Marseille, or even heroin specifically. It's about how durable these structures actually are once they become embedded in the legitimate institutions around them. How A criminal network that starts as two ambitious men providing muscle to a political faction in the 1920s can survive its founder's death, survive a change in political era, survive the loss of two successive generations of leadership to assassination and imprisonment, and require, in the end, not a single dramatic bust or a single celebrated film, but 60 continuous years of pressure culminating in the death of one of the only people who ever seriously threatened it, before the specific machine this video has traced finally, gradually stopped being the dominant force it had been for most of the 20th century. Hollywood gave you 2 years of that story, told well, dramatized effectively, and ultimately, however unintentionally, deeply incomplete. Tonight, we gave you the other 60. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that wraps a story up in a neat bow when the actual history doesn't allow for one. Pierre Michel's death didn't end this network story any more than the 1962 bust did. The pipeline adapted, the geography of the trade shifted, and somewhere, right now, a version of the exact same structural pattern this video has spent the last 2 hours tracing is very likely still playing out, in a different city, under a different name, with the same underlying logic of political protection, manufacturing infrastructure, and violence that Carbone and Spirito worked out in 1920s. If you want the next chapter of this, the networks that filled the space Marseille left behind, or any of the other stories this channel exists to tell the real version of, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.